This is a continuation of the story of David Haldane Smith, a Port Glasgow War hero who died on November the 1st, 1914. In part 1, John Smith, his great-nephew and the storyteller, detailed how David was killed by friendly fire near Ypres in Belgium. Following the revelations of how David Haldane Smith had died, John wanted to do some research on David's awards and final resting place.
The curator at the King's Own Scottish Borderers gave John information on David's war medal details. He was awarded the British War Medal, the Victory Medal and a star with clasp. The clasp was only awarded to those who saw action. There was also a certificate sent to his widow Agnes from the army. This copy again was given to John by the curator of the museum.
John also wanted to find more about David's final resting place. He had discovered previously that David and the rest of his platoon had been killed by the Royal Artillery while sheltering in a house in the village of Wouvergem in Belgium. John discovered he had been buried in the small graveyard at Wouvergem with 3 fellow soldiers from the platoon. David, 7420, was 38. Private Hugh Hendry was 33, with only 2 digits different in his regimental number, 7418. He was originally from Montrose. The other 2 soldiers, Privates Goodman and Cairns, were new recruits and in their 20s. All 4 were together.
The village cemetery is 13 kilometres south of Ypres. There is a church nearby that was ruined during the war and rebuilt in 1925. It is a small cemetery with 38 graves, 23 of which were further destroyed by the war. From the map and photograph, David's grave and headstone are given as A3, and so David's headstone is the third from the left, facing us in the photograph.
John thought with the resting place and awards he had completed David's story for his brother. He was pleased with the outcome. Some weeks later, a friend asked John to do some historical research. David was not involved. It was, however, using the Port Glasgow Express records in the James Watt Library in Greenock. Whilst John was there, he decided out of curiosity to search further about David. He wanted to see how the newspaper had reported the first few weeks of World War I in Port Glasgow.
War began on August the 4th, 1914. At first, the newspaper showed only approved news. Then letters and postcards came from the front. Much more personal details were in the newspaper. On November the 4th, the headline was Our Fallen Heroes. It told of the deaths of 2 soldiers. One was Harry McKinnon of the King's Own Scottish Borderers, 2nd Battalion, the same as David. The second was Alexander Cooper of the 1st Royal Dragoons.
Harry McKinnon had lived at Morrison's building in the Glen in Port Glasgow. He had served 3 years in the Argyll and Southern Highlanders before he moved to the King's Own Scottish Borderers. Before the war, he had been almost a year away from Port Glasgow. He was in Dublin with the 2nd Battalion. He was considered a big man in Port Glasgow. He had been 4 years a riveter. He worked in William Hamilton's Glen Yard.
Harry served in Dublin Barracks. His unit fought in the recent riot there. This was with alleged gunrunners at Howth. He left for the war from Dublin along with David Smith. They arrived in Belgium on the 15th of August. He must have known David, John thought. Harry fought in all engagements in France and Belgium. These would have been Mons, Le Cateau, Marne, Aisne and Ypres. He was fatally wounded by shrapnel shot. A few days before, he sent his mother a postcard. He said they were fighting night and day, and sometimes all night. He said also the field of battle was a butcher shop rather than a war.
Alexander Cooper, the second casualty, was also a riveter. He worked for the Clyde Shipbuilding and Engineering Company in the Bay Area. He initially joined the King's Own Scottish Borderers some years back. 4 years ago, in 1910, he became a cavalryman. He transferred to the 1st Royal Dragoons. He spent the last 4 years in South Africa. He was based at Potchefstroom, southwest of Johannesburg. He had only returned to England on the 9th of September. On that leave, he was walking the streets of Port Glasgow. He only enjoyed 2 days. He was ordered with 5 others to the front. They landed on the 8th of October at Ostend.
He wrote home regularly, and his last postcard arrived in November. His home was at 24 Bay Street, Port Glasgow. However, another postcard to the father of one of his comrades said Alexander was killed. This happened on the 26th of October in Belgium, near Langemarck. This was during the Battle of Ypres. So John now realised the newspaper was giving details of soldiers' lives and deaths as the war progressed.
Reports like these made John feel that at this early stage of the war, the Port Glasgow Express would focus on individuals in the town, till perhaps it got too much to report on all of them. Harry McKinnon was reported on again with the inclusion of a photograph. There was also a letter dated the 17th of September 1914 to his sister Nellie. He must have wrote this as a happy soldier, as the Allies had just won the Battle of the Marne and the Battle of the Aisne. In this letter he states he had been, as David Smith must have been, in combat 5 times. He had fought at the Battle of Mons. He fought at the holding action at Le Cateau during the full retreat from Mons. He also fought at the Battle of Marne as the tide turned for the Allies. Harry was also at the Battle of the Aisne.
He was now digging in for the first trench war. He told Nellie they had lost a terrible lot of men. He, nevertheless, wanted from his sister fags and socks, as they had marched so many miles. He joked about the party they would have when they had got back. He had saved money as a soldier, had not been paid yet.
A third soldier's history, Private John Davidson, gave even clearer views of the fighting David was involved in. The newspaper said he had returned from the war. He was recovering from a gunshot wound at 1 Williams Lane in Port Glasgow. He mirrored David's career. He had been a reservist for upwards of 9 years in the King's Own Scottish Borderers. His time would have been up in February 1915. He was, as David was, a riveter in Russell's Dockyard. He was called to arms on the 3rd of August. He proceeded to Berwick, then Dublin. He left on the 13th of August. They arrived at Le Havre on the 15th. Surely David was with him.
The regiment went on a 2-day journey by rail to the fighting at Mons. It was a rearguard action at Mons. The King's Own Scottish Borderers were right in the front line, and they barely survived. John was involved in the retreat. He was again in the front line at Le Cateau with the King's Own Scottish Borderers and helped to hold up the Germans. It was at the River Marne the Allies regrouped. They pushed forward to victory over the Germans. On the 13th of September, the River Aisne was crossed. Private Davidson was wounded the next day. This was when the whole British Expeditionary Forces were digging trenches. It was also where David was on the 14th of September. John sailed to Southampton. The surgeons operated. The nursing staff cared for him. The army sent him home to mend. He may then have gone back to war when he recovered.
So John, our storyteller, had fuller descriptions of what David had gone through. In the next issue, John came across the headline, "Our Fallen Heroes Once Again." This was the report John was looking for. It was of David Haldane Smith's death. It stated that the newspaper was told of his death by David's wife Agnes. She was living at Alexander Smith's house at 43 Argown Street, Port Glasgow. Alexander was David's father. David, we are told, was a riveter at the Russell Shipbuilding Company at the Kingston Yard. He was indeed a reservist. He joined the colours a few weeks before the outbreak of war. They said he fell on the 1st of November. He was an active member of the Boilermakers. He was a staunch Jacobite and a teetotaler. David was born in the port. He was a member of the New Ark Church.
He had written in his last letter home, "My dear wife, just a few lines to let you know I am well. Hope the letter will find you the same. I thank God for all his kindness to us. How are Hughie and little Aggie doing? We are having a rough time of it here, and it is getting cold. I send my love to my father, mother, brothers and sister, and I pray to God every night to keep you safe in his keeping." 3 days later he was killed.
There was a final tribute to David. It was from the chief ruler of the Racobites in the next edition of the newspaper. He promised to send a letter of condolence to Agnes. David had apparently, in the early 1900s, joined the Racobites' cause. It was at a soldier's mission in Egypt. This edition of the newspaper also supplied the crowning accolade to David. It was this full-length dress photograph.
As a final commemoration of the town's regard of its war heroes, one last tribute was uncovered. The town of Port Glasgow did not finish celebrating its war heroes by the building of the town's war memorial in 4th Street. Others also showed their appreciation.
The New Ark Church graveyard at the top of Balfour Street is a place to visit. The church has in the graveyard the graves of possibly the town's 3 most famous sons. There is John Wood Sr., who was commissioned by Henry Bell to build the Comet steamship. Also John Wood Jr., who completed the Comet. He was considered by Robert Duncan, another Port Glasgow shipbuilder, as the finest shipbuilder on the Clyde. He built a cross-Atlantic paddle steamship, the Arcadia, for the Cunard Company in 1841. Charles Wood, his brother, is also buried here. He built a second cross-Atlantic Cunarder in 1841 called the Caledonia. Alongside these illustrious occupants, the church erected a fine memorial tablet. It commemorates the war dead of its congregation. It is there that a lasting recognition is made of David Haldane Smith's contribution to the First World War and Scotland.